Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week we come to you from the show floor of Freedom Fest, the annual trade show for liberty in Las Vegas. Anchoring our program will be John Mackey, co-CEO of Whole Foods and the guiding spirit behind the conscious capitalism movement. Along the way, we'll chat with Jeffrey Tucker, who recounts the horrendous history of the settled science of eugenics and its promotion by the early progressive movement. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Steve Horwitz, professor of economics at St. Lawrence University. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Steve, the country is sitting at a very unusual juncture, and I asked John to reflect on whether this portends massive change. Our entrenched political parties managed to select competing presidential candidates with the lowest favorability rating since polling was created, and it's hard to imagine how Congress's approval ratings can go any lower. We're at the end of the presidency of the first black American to hold that office, and contrary to all hopes, race relations have been set back 50 years. The Mideast is in turmoil, spewing refugees and terrorists. Europe's coming apart at the seams, and the central bankers have taken accommodative monetary policy to such extremes that many people fear the global financial system is heading for a crack-up. Does this strike you as a world yearning for libertarian solutions, or maybe one ripe for the proverbial man on a horse?
Well, I think it's actually both, right? I think that what we're looking at here is a situation where people are looking at the same problems and diagnosing the solutions very differently.
Interesting.
You can't deny in Trump and in what's happened in Europe the sort of belief that we need the man on the horse, or we need the strong man to come in and fix all the problems. And I think there's many people who are worried that the source of these problems are from the outside, whether it's immigrants or whomever, right? And so the idea, if we can just, quote, make America great again, or make Europe great again, or make Britain great again.
Or find a common enemy.
Right, exactly, right. Find a common enemy, that somehow if we can defeat that, we can get back to this imagined world where everything was great. And I think part of the problem we see in that group is a nostalgia for a time that they think existed and I'm not so sure was so great. At the same time, right, I do think you see in younger people in particular a kind of inchoate sense that freedom works, and a kind of frustration with, in bits and pieces, the way that governments in particular have caused many of these problems, right? And that government's inept and incompetent and crooked and all these sorts of things. And that for those people, I don't know if I'd say they're yearning for a libertarian solution, but a lot of people vaguely understand that we're overregulated, we're overcontrolled, and that government just can't get things done. And they see in their own lives the way other kinds of bottom-up solutions work, and they just don't know how to put that into practice.
Well, it's very interesting. If you look at the campaign arc of Bernie Sanders, a lot of people on both the right and left agree that he correctly diagnosed the problem, right? The fix is in. Stuff is broken, right? And yet he came up with solutions that some celebrated and others found abhorrent.
Right. He got it right. Sort of cronyism and corporatism, that's the problem. But the idea that you solve the problem of corporations having too much power in the government by giving government more power seems problematic.
Seems kind of strange to some people.
Yeah.
You look at how the electorate is breaking down. A recent Gallup poll tried to unbundle the political beliefs, and it seems to make the case, at least the poll did, that libertarians now comprise the single biggest group with 27% of the electorate, and they were followed by conservatives at 26% and liberals at 23%. Populists were down at 15%, and 10% didn't fit anywhere. What do you make of this effort to sort of unbundle the political beliefs and maybe reshuffle the deck?
I think it's good. I think what's interesting, that we see libertarians, small L, kind of come out on top of that, right? And I suspect that especially the case among young people. But what I also think is many of those people who come out of those things being marked as libertarians are not especially political, or in particular don't have a sense that there's a home for them to go to, whether intellectually or politically or whatever. So they are, in some sense of the term, libertarian, but they're either non-voters
or engaged.
Yeah, they're just not engaged, or they kind of shrug their shoulders and vote for the least bad, which is why I do think Clinton versus Trump is an unparalleled opportunity. Both candidates are so bad that the ability to accept the lesser of the two evils just isn't even on the table. They're both so bad.
The formula's not working as well as it used to.
So it's an opportunity to get at those 27% in a way that libertarians have never had before.
Well, I grew up and came from the tech community, and there's a fairly heavy representation of what you might call classical market liberals in that group. And their approach has usually been to just disengage. Focus on building their business, focusing on making better products, focus on getting rich, and just try to stay out of politics.
Well, right. And then you have, I think, younger folks who don't know any world without the internet, who understand people can solve their own problems in these sort of bottom-up, decentralized ways. Now they have Uber and all the rest that show them government monopolies don't work. You can use technology. You can use human connections to do the things you want to do. And they're just used to kind of working around the political process in a way. So they are disengaged from it as a thing.
What do you make of the millennials? I mean, how do they break down? How do they fit into this puzzle?
I think, we saw a lot of millennial support for Bernie Sanders, and I think that's because he was an outsider.
Well, and same with Ron Paul.
Right, Ron Paul.
They both were pop stars on campus, and they're from the opposite ends of the spectrum.
Because they don't look like your typical politician. They were saying things that weren't like your typical politician. I do think Bernie Sanders, in some sense, pandered to the younger group with the free college and all that kind of stuff. But they're frustrated by the system, and these got both. Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders were people attacking the system. Now we have an interesting question. Bernie Sanders, of course, has just endorsed Hillary Clinton and completely sold out whatever radicalism he had after calling her unfit for the presidency. How will young people react to that? Is it just, oh, well, he's just another politician? And if so, where do they go? Again, I think the libertarians, I think Gary Johnson and Bill Weld have an unparalleled opportunity to stake a claim here and try to get into this conversation.
So, Steve, if something akin to the laws of gravity dictate that America can only have two major political parties, unlike the multi-party systems you see in parliamentary governments, and take that as a premise, don't argue with me about that, in what ways could the electorate be ideologically reshuffled to create two stable groupings? Should the existing Democratic and Republican coalitions break apart?
Well, one possible way is kind of a split between, for lack of better terminology, what we might call the cosmopolitans and the populists, right? One could imagine the sort of free trade, free market version of the Republicans and the free trade internationalist, less interventionist, the centrist Democrats kind of forming together, and libertarians perhaps as well, to sort of have a movement that generally was internationalist, that was more welcoming to immigrants and to free trade, was sort of progressive in the broadest sense of that term.
Right.
And on the other side of that, you would have what looks like Trumpism, right? The differences between Trump and Bernie Sanders on many issues are not all that great. This kind of economic nationalism, of fear of immigrants, a fear of economic change, call it populism if you want to. And that becomes a kind of interesting split because it's true, libertarians and at least the sort of free trade internationalist, free market Republicans have commonalities, I think, with the more reasonable internationalist, cosmopolitan, free trading, roughly Democrats. And you can imagine if those two parties just didn't go, couldn't work anymore as they're comprised. Because I do think the Democrats are seeing a split too.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of Democrats who are going to vote for Trump. And it concerns
scary
me.
For everybody.
Yeah. Working class Democrats, right? Hillary Clinton's not one of them. Right.
So let's stay with this for a moment and look at the broad constituencies that might be looking for a new home. Where do the entitlement mongerers go?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? I think one way of thinking about the Trump phenomenon is essentially one group of Trump supporters, I think, are working class whites who've basically said, look, every other group has sort of got into the process and staked their claim to getting a piece of the government pie based on their identity, whether they're poor or non-white or whatever. Where's ours, right? I think many of them are saying let's join tribal warfare.
Yeah, exactly. And let's give our tribe a piece of the pie.
Exactly. Let's play their game, right? That's a scary thing, but you can see why they would feel that way. They perceive it, I'm not sure, they're not right, but they perceive it as we've been cut out of this process and we've given and given and we've paid and paid and paid. Where's our turn? And I think whatever Trump's own substantive views are, he's opened this sort of lid to Pandora's box on this and a lot of the nasty stuff and sort of given it legitimacy and given it a kind of place in the political process that it didn't have before.
Well, it's funny. I got back in touch with my junior high school English teacher, believe it or not, one of my favorite teachers of all time, who was a liberal and was a union leader.
Yeah.
And he's become a rabid Trump supporter. And I can't quite figure out what's going on.
Well, if he sees himself as a friend of the working class, it's hard to argue Hillary Clinton is, even if you've sort of been a liberal and Democrat, and again, Trump's position on sort of free trade and all that is not all that different from Bernie Sanders, right? The difference is Trump sees economic nationalism as good for the bottom line in some sense, where Bernie saw it as good for the working class. They might, in some sense, both be right in a vague way. I mean, I think the working class would ultimately lose by it, but you can see why they would think that in the short run. And so whether it's capital or labor that they think would benefit, it's U.S. capital and labor. And I can see why, an old line liberal Democrat who's concerned about the working class might be suckered into that story, even though I think economically it's a bad one.
So let's stay with this a little longer. Where do the evangelical Christians end up?
I have to say, one of the most bizarre parts of this to me is how many have said they're going to vote for Trump. I don't get it, how you can hold those beliefs and vote for this guy. I mean, divorce 3 times that's one thing, but under the circumstances and the affairs and the shady business deals and the language and the sort of
he's certainly not a values candidate.
It's the right wing version of the Bernie Sanders sellout, right? In some sense, right?
Interesting.
Is Hillary really that bad? I suspect that what's driving it is the Supreme Court. They think, whether they're right or not is a good question, that at least Trump would put a better person, would replace Scalia with a better person than Hillary Clinton would. And to the degree those evangelicals are motivated by sort of the abortion issue or the same-sex marriage issue, which should be over and done with by now, or the trans issue in bathrooms, whatever crazy social problem they're imagining that they need the Supreme Court for, I do think that might be, it's a calculation to say Trump can't be worse than Clinton on picking the next justice.
Steve, you call yourself a bleeding heart libertarian. How does that compare to the other libertarian flavors?
Well, I think a couple of different ways. I think, bleeding heart libertarians, the one thing I think that those of us who use that label have in common is that we put our concern for the least well-off in society at the top of our list of either how we justify libertarian ideas, that libertarian ideas are morally good because they work to the benefit of the least well-off, or how we just talk about libertarian ideas, right? As a kind of matter of rhetoric, we should always emphasize that that's why libertarian ideas are so good and so valuable.
So that's in contrast to the hard Ayn Rand school.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I think that's something of a caricature of Rand herself, though there are Randians about whom that would be accurate. It's the difference between don't tread on me and don't tread on anyone else.
Interesting.
The philosophers who call themselves bleeding heart libertarians really do make a sort of deep moral argument that what should morally justify libertarianism is that it serves the needs of the least well-off. For me, I'm not a philosopher. For me, it's just the idea that why is market capitalism good? The thing we should be putting forward is it has made the poor richer for 200 plus years. That's what's so great about it, is how many people it's pulled out of poverty, both in the U.S. and worldwide. And those are the kind of things we should be emphasizing.
That story seems to have disappeared. 1 billion people have lifted themselves out of abject poverty because of markets, and no one talks about it.
And we used to talk about living on less than $1 a day. Now we talk about living less than $2 a day. Why? Because there's just so many fewer people living. Yeah, right. I think Deirdre McCloskey's new book, the Bourgeois Equality book, really hammers this home clearly, both domestically and worldwide. And I've done a lot of work on this issue of how in the United States over the last 50 years, poor and middle class Americans have never lived better than they do right now, despite all the
from an absolute perspective, not a relative perspective. The relative perspective freaks people out.
Yeah, it does. And even from a relative perspective, it's tricky, right? So for example, from a relative perspective, for most of human history, we were divided into 2 groups, the haves and the have-nots, and there was a small group of haves and a whole lot of have-nots. Yep. The United States today, we're divided differently. We're into a large group of haves and a small groups of have a lot and have better, right? From the longer perspective, even the poorest of Americans today live really, really well compared to humans
on an absolute scale. Nobody wants to recognize that.
Right, but I want to argue even on a relative scale. Look, Bill Gates has cars. Poor Americans have cars. Bill Gates has better and nicer and more cars than he has, but we have cars. You go to a basketball game and there's Mark Cuban, right, the multi-billionaire owner of the Dallas Mavericks, sitting there in a T-shirt and jeans. All the fans are sitting there in T-shirt. And even on a relative level, right, I have a house with, I'm fairly well off by American standards, but even poor Americans, most of them have houses, with electricity and appliances and air conditioning. So does Bill Gates. It's just bigger and better.
It reminds me of an old story when The Grapes of Wrath first came out.
I love this story, yes.
Right, the communists took it to show it all across the Soviet Union to show how awful things were in America, and the peasants there looked at it and said, cars?
Poor Americans have cars?
They have cars?
Yeah, right. No, I love telling that story for just that reason. And so I think, how you want to talk about even the relative question, I think, is important.
So let's get back to the political crack-up that's happening around us. Given the traditional ferocity with which the Libertarian Party casts out anyone who's not a true believer, how did they end up nominating 2 liberal Republicans to represent them?
I think they came to their senses. I mean,
but you can't call them libertarians.
maybe with a very small L. I mean, they're not what the LP has normally thought should be libertarians. But I think that they recognize that Gary Johnson is enough of a libertarian. And I think, as we've seen, there was a lot of concern about Weld at the convention, but I think it's like on the CNN town hall, in many ways, Weld was better than Johnson, right? I mean, he was more articulate and he was funny. I mean, so I think the LP has come to realize, okay, maybe we did okay here. And I think they see this, at least the wise ones see this as an opportunity to get the libertarian voice, even in a less radical form than they might prefer, into the conversation, into debates. And with Trump versus Clinton, you could not afford to stand on purity this year. You had to bring in a credible slate of candidates. And these two guys are way more credible in terms of political executive experience and sanity than the two leaders.
So, Steve, do you see Gary Johnson and William Weld cracking the 15% threshold required to get them into the presidential debates?
Oh, I think it's hard. I think it's harder than people think it is. I mean, they're running in the best polls right now. They're running 10, 11% as we talk. So they're really close. By the way, the organizers of the debates can let them in with less than 15. They have some discretion. Okay,
oh, they do
a little bit, but it'd be a hard case to make. But I do think it would be better if they could get to 15. I'm not, and the clock is ticking. You basically have 2 months to do it, right? I don't know what more they could do. This again, the CNN town hall helped. I think that the advertising they put out has been great. There's a lot of people saying, I don't know what I'm going to do. My longtime teaching partner's father is 82 years old, and he's kind of country club, free market Republican type. And he said to her recently, for the first time in my life, I don't know what I'm going to do.
My mom's an 85-year-old New Deal Democrat, and she doesn't know what to do.
And so my teaching partner has been, has I think actually voted for Gary Johnson last time around, but basically said to her father, you should look at Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. And he said he would. One of three things is going to happen. When Election Day comes, either they're going to say, you know what, I'm going to cast the vote for Johnson and Weld, or they're just going to say, I can't do it, stay home, or they're going to walk into that booth and go, I can't vote for a third party, right, and just pick one. That's why I think Johnson and Weld have to continue to press their credibility and their own records, that they're actually real people with real experience. They're not crazy libertarians off the street.
So where does the Green Party fit in all this? I understand they offered Bernie Sanders their slot as their presidential candidate, and he turned him down.
Right, and thank God he didn't take it. It would have really hurt the libertarians, I think, had Bernie taken it. Yeah, there will be some former Sanders voters, I think, who might vote for Gary Johnson.
Why didn't he take it? Doesn't he belong there?
He does. I think there was immense pressure on him not to do. If he'd taken that, I think he would have stole more votes from Hillary. I'm sure the Clinton machine put immense pressure on him not to do that. The Clintons are very good at getting their message across clearly and unequivocally.
So where do the Greens fit? Are they on the ballot in all states?
I don't think they'll make all 50, but they will make a majority. And I think that's, in broad sense, that's a good thing. If they weren't there, who would it help or hurt? Not clear. I know some progressive friends of mine, like faculty members, who I think will vote Green precisely because they just can't stomach voting for Hillary. And it is an interesting split among my progressive friends about whether you sort of cave in and vote for Hillary because you got to stop Trump, or you can't, on principle, vote for the sort of corporatist warmonger, right?
So before I ask you not to argue with me, but let me take that back. Do you ever see a multi-party system evolving here in America?
I think it's really hard. I think the Constitution is just structured in ways, and we've allowed the institutions to develop in ways that make it very hard for a multi-party system to develop. And the history is that as third parties get big and get popular, one of the other parties evolves and co-opts their ideas. So I think our earlier conversation about what would a reshuffled two-party system look like is probably the more likely outcome. It's been a long time since we've seen that happen. And
it's happened, though, in history.
It has happened, and it could happen again. But I think that seems to me to be the more likely way that sort of libertarian, classical liberal ideas would get themselves into the party structure.
It's very easy to look around, get discouraged, and declare the glass half empty. In what ways do bleeding heart libertarians see the glass half full?
Well, I think, we talked about one earlier, which is in the United States right now, life in sort of a material sense has never been better, and not just for the rich, but for the poor too. Poor Americans live better than they ever did. Middle-class Americans live better than they ever did. We have this new data out showing that the decline of the middle class, the smaller number of people in middle class, is because so many people have moved into the upper middle class as measured in real income. So we're seeing over time more and more, on average, of course, Americans getting better and better lives. We have amazing medical technology. People are living longer. We have opportunities. We have all the world's knowledge in our pockets. I mean, all those things are great. And I think there's that happening globally, too. But I also think from a libertarian perspective, we tend to talk about the economics and forget the other stuff. Despite the size of government, compared in the long run, we are much more free in other dimensions than we were before. We can start by saying women and non-whites have many more freedoms than they did 100, 150 years ago.
Sure.
But even put that aside, we have more freedom to read things and see movies and sort of consume goods in ways that, we never had before. Even with all the draconian stuff with the drug laws, right? You can get, in some ways, at least at a personal level, you can get around them, and they're easing up. The marijuana laws are easing up in
There's
states.
a lot of ballot initiatives
Yeah,
coming
there
up
are.
to legalize.
I think the millennials and the boomers are going to, eventually that's going to happen. And same-sex marriage, another good example.
That fight's over.
Right. It's over, but call it a freedom if you want. That, it's an opportunity to live one's life as one wishes in a way that people didn't have before. So I think across these non-economic dimensions, we're much freer. And even on the economic side, people, on average, I don't want to, discount the fact that for some people, life has remained challenging and difficult. The poor are still with us, as somebody once said. But even what it means to be poor is not as bad as it used to be.
So we're not in the last days of the Roman Empire?
I don't think my good friend Larry Reed likes to tell us we are. I'm not sure that we are. There are things that should scare us, right? I mean, the debt should scare us, and there's other things that should scare us, and certainly, depending on the outcome of the election this fall, we might have more reason to be scared. And I think we're going to have reason to be scared either way. It depends more or less. So, those things worry. But I think part of the message for liberty lovers should be that politics maybe isn't as important as we sometimes think it is. That people have ways of getting around the state they never did before. Uber is, the kind of classic example. You can get this ride without having to use the state taxi monopoly, right? So I think there's ways to dance around the state that there didn't used to be, and the technology and wealth has made that possible.
Well, Steve, thanks for giving us a little hope. It's been a delight chatting with you.
My pleasure, Bill. Thanks for having me.
That was Steve Horwitz, professor of economics at St. Lawrence University, speaking with us from the show floor at Freedom Fest here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Old Boston Restorations, a Victorian property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. Ahead, we'll speak with Jeffrey Tucker, Director of Content for the Foundation for Economic Education. Stay tuned.